Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this South Asian Heritage Month event and South Asian Writers event and Partition Education Group event as well. We are the last event on the South Asian Heritage Month official program. And today is the commemoration date for Partition. It is the 17th of August, and we will be examining partition history through the lens of Twice Migrants and the Twice Migrant community that sit within this historical story, and we will be examining that through the historical lens, but also the personal and how that has reverberated through time, through family, through language, through story and storytelling also. We are joined by Dr. Sana Ayer, who's a historian of modern South Asian history and the South Asian diaspora as well, transitional history. Dr. Ian Patel, who's part of the LSE Human Rights, and he has historically grounded approaches to human rights, justice, and migration. And Professor Parminder Bhachu, who studies the very complex movement of people across international borders and actually coined the concept of twice migrants as well. And Saz Vora, who is wife, mother, author, BBC broadcaster, and was born in East Africa and migrated over to Coventry in the 60s. And Sneha Pruitt, who is a historian, poet, and writer of Kenyan and Indian descent and heritage. And she is writing a book at the moment that is out next year in 2022 entitled British Indian Journeys of Migration and Integration. And also we're joined by the Vice Chair of Partition Education Group, Amina Malik. And I am your chair this evening. My name is Natasha Janejo. I'm the literary lead of South Asian Heritage Month and the founder of South Asian Writers. So without further ado, we are going to get cracking with some history and background of Twice Migrants. So, Professor Parminder Bhachu, hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having us and for organizing this event. I think these are such big contributions and really so much more powerful in the generation that you belong to and the current period. So, I was asked if I could talk about how I came up with this concept of twice migrants. So let me tell you my story as an undergraduate and in school, because it is at that stage when I was an undergraduate that I did a project in my final year. So this is probably before some of you were born, probably many of you were born, and this is in the mid-70s. In my final year, I did an ethnographic fieldwork project. I studied anthropology. This was at University College in London. And I did that project because I was noticing the differences between people who are directly migrant and people who later on I wrote about them as twice migrants. So this is what was going on. This is what my young self, my undergraduate self, was noticing. And people were talking about this around me, that so at that stage, the Twice Migrants, the group that I wrote about, had been in London for under a decade. They'd started coming, well, some of them had come in the early 60s, but mostly from mid-60s onwards with a big input, with a big group that came in 1967, 68, when their jobs were, Africanized after independence in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, which is 61, 62, 63, and 64. Kenya becomes it becomes an independent state, and so this is what I was noticing, that there were there were people who were who had entered the system and were not interested in investing in India. They were very orientated towards staying in Britain. You could also see the ways in which the community was organized. They already had a certain amount of sophistication in the community organizations, and also it was you never heard stories which you here for a number of people who migrated directly, which is that we came with £3, because in lots of ways this community really was already formed and it re-diasporized. It was move. I did not at that stage as an undergraduate have the terminology that that became the project that of Twice Migrants, but there were clear differences between people who moved, and even though they had been in Britain for a longer period, often people had been there since the Second World War, etc. Their community organization was not at the stage, at the same level as which it was for Twice Migrants. At the point of entry, within a very short period, they were developing the communities, reestablishing their networks, etc. And the other thing was that families were unifying very quickly. Either immediately they came as a family, or the family unification took place within a couple of years, and they bought houses almost immediately or soon after. And also in school, when I was in school, I went to a very white British school. I mean, my generation are really products of secondary modern schools, third-rate schools. But I had a lucky break because somebody who I was classified as non-selective, not suitable for selective education, and a headmistress did a deal with a very meritocratic school and went against the local authority decision, which is very rare. Once you're classified, it's very difficult to get out of that classification. And I used to notice that there was one other Indian woman in my school, and she really wanted to adopt lots of the values of the white women, the girls there, and it was so this Twice migrant community seemed to be much more ethnically assertive, much more willing to be to reproduce their cultural base and resist racism, etc. Where I was raised in South London. It's the same area that Hanif Qureshi writes about. His book, The Buddha of Suburbia, is set in that area. It's very racist. He calls it Jew-free London. He means it's not cosmopolitan and so on and so forth. So this is what I was capturing in this project. I mean, the differences. And also it was on marriage and dowry. And so that's exactly the project that I then took on as a PhD. It's my observations as a 21-year-old that later on became the project of Twice Migrants. So when I was, so my PhD was on that. And of course, at that time, I did, almost a year and a half longer fieldwork. I lived in Southall. And so I developed that story. And this is what was very clear in Southall and various other places. This community was already there as a sort of Punjabi community, but it's when the Twice Migrants, which remember at that time, it's now a concept because, and I'll tell you why it's become a concept. I was noticing a pattern, a migration trajectory, a way of being in the world, a way of organizing yourself as an immigrant. So what I mean, like if you looked at the houses in Southall, the people who were Twice Migrants actually, because they already came with technical skills, and I'll make that point again, they put in central heating and they really refurbished the houses very quickly because they had the skill. And also the key thing that emerged from my PhD was that they did not have a myth of return. The myth of return was that you invest in the country from which you come. And in the case of direct migrants, it was India or Pakistan or Bangladesh and so on and so forth. So this group was not doing that. It had already done that in the 1920s, 30s in East Africa. And by the time, by the 1940s, many were not doing this at all. India was not significant in terms of going back or investing. But you learn from Sana Iyer's work that there were people who were into Indian politics and into decolonization. But there were many others for whom India was not central. They did invest, my own grandfather. And there were many men like that. Right from the point of entry, they were not interested in going back to India. Kenya was considered to be the America of the Hindus. And So they had that mindset. But what they did was they did send money back to their families and relatives in India, and they made properties. And many people did that. But they often were not able to recoup these because they were taken over by relatives in India, or they just lost them. They lost their investments. And some did go back in the 60s, some went back in the 50s, but they really did not succeed very well in settling there. So this notion of the myth of return was very powerful. And at the time, the literature on immigrants was that immigrants came from somewhere, they settled somewhere. And so it was like one migration. And many people did not have, so my PhD really was it contested that point of view, that there's a single migration, because in fact there are many people who were not direct migrants. And in my later work, this has become clear that my fans are going and my throat is drying up. It's a very hot day here, so you'll have to forgive me for coughing a little bit. So at the time, the emphasis was on a single migration, and so at that time, it was the pattern I was noticing was that there were people who had moved once and they'd moved the second time, and their orientations, their mindset, the way they were, whether they did not give up turbans to get a job, which many migrants from India did, and I mean, this giving up of your sort of ethnicity, or the symbols of your ethnicity, rather. So that was something that was new. And the other thing was, which I didn't know at the time, but also learned later on, I did a book called Enterprising Women, is that the entry of women into the labor market at the point of entry was on par, almost exactly, with local mainstream British white women. And this was different for the other groups. I think it was something like 37% for women who came from India directly, and Pakistanis were somewhere, Pakistani women were about under 20%, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the entry into the labor market at the point of, as soon as the entry is at the same level. So there is, I mean, at some level you could read it as a class difference, but also you could read it as a migration advantage, because it's a community that was already formed. It moves, the connections are made very quickly, and there are already skills of building the infrastructure in East Africa, which skills that are reproduced. So the Twice Migrant framework, that it defined how people were in Britain, and it was to do with multiple migration. So the work that I've developed after that has been that I've looked at the creativity in my new book, Movers and Makers. I developed that theme of multiple migrations further. So I did not know when I got a fellowship at UCLA that Twice Migrants applied to many groups in the US. It applied to the Armenians, to the Iranians, to the Vietnamese. And that was news to me. And over the years, it's become a concept, a pattern which I described for one community of multiple migrations has now become a concept because it applies to so many other groups in the US. So, and this group, and the characteristics of the multiple migrants, I now call them multiple migrants because I myself am a quadrice migrant, and it doesn't sound very good to say that. I just say multiple migrants. You see that 40 years ago I was talking about twice migrants, and so in the current, that has I've developed that concept, and I've advanced that notion of what happens to people when they move. And if you look at the partition story, in lots of ways, there are also people who have exactly the same trajectory. People went to Pakistan and were sent back. And in India, too, some of the most successful entrepreneurial families, who came with nothing, had left everything behind, have some of the characteristics of that group are similar. So I refer to the skills that multiple migrants carry, as movement capital, and and that movement capital is to do with both the cultural dexterity, technical dexterity, and now, in the past decade, and my most recent work, I've been looking at the ways in which this has become one of the most creative groups in the world, and it's a group that does not have elite roots, or is not from an elite location, but their migration, their movement has meant that at every stage they've advanced their capital. And Ricardo Hausmann, who studies some of these, talks about how every move meant that people came with some skills, and those skills were reproduced at higher levels in the next stage. So you see people who come from this background, who have this movement capital, are people who are defining many aspects of the 21st century, but they're invisible to us. I don't think we think when we land at Heathrow Terminal 5 that that's been designed by a Twice migrant, Amarjit Kalsi, and that the person who led the most daring scientific experiment, the Large Hadron Collider, where the Higgs boson was found, is exactly from a Twice migrant background, Tejinder Virdi, and there's so many others. And so in thinking about this, I've actually thought about the number of Twice migrants who are so significant in the world in which we occupy. I just don't mean Asians, but the same trajectory that I described for a community, which is now a concept, applies to people like Nubor Rafian, who is a Twice migrant, the person behind the Moderna vaccine, Nikola Tesla, the batteries man, who I won't go into his pattern, is Croatia to Austria to Paris to, it's that multiple migration pattern. And I think that there's something about movement that gives you the powers of innovation and the ability to look at things in new ways. And this group is also a group that really shares its expertise. So I talk about the ways in which their collaborative and sharing powers are reflected in the ways in which they are in the 21st century. Whether you are Suneet Tully, who developed the $50 handheld computer, which does everything that an iPad does, is bringing knowledge to the billions. And if you look at the ways in which Amarjit Kalsi worked, or Tejinder Virdi, the Large Hadron Collider, their powers are the ability to collaborate, to share knowledge. So they don't operate like many elites in the world, where you code your goods, you share them, you do not share them, you reproduce that elite capital. And I think that that aesthetic, that sensibility, is to do with the Twice migrants in the ways in which they formed themselves as pioneering communities in places like East Africa, where, I didn't bring my slides, but, they started by having corrugated iron temples. And these temples were, everybody in the community had to get together. And so I'm saying that the pioneering aesthetic, which was of sharing knowledge, of helping each other out, it remains the really powerful sensibility. And it's the font, the source code of how these people operate in the world. So that's the story that I tell, that movement, and I have wonderful examples of people who've written about movement and how movement is good for you. The enormous obstacles that you face when you move to new places and you move many times, but also the enormous benefits that you accrue. Theodore Waite says that if you stay stable and static in one place, he says it's like an everlasting disease. So this is the way in which I thought of Twice Migrants, a project of a 21-year-old who is noticing what is being talked about within the community and the things that are obvious. And also, there is, because it's a community that already had skills, it had cultural skills, political skills, etc. It is a community, if you look at the early cases, Ali versus Mandla, which is a case of a headmaster who sued a private school headmaster, a solicitor whose son was not allowed to wear a turban. And, this was taken by the CRE, and it became a case which they lost at the court, but won at the House of Lords, which got the 6 defined as an ethnic group and a race. I mean, that the legal wranglings, the sophistication that went into organizing that, was a reflection of what people had already learned in East Africa. So I think I've probably had my 10 minutes, Natasha, because one of the things I did want to say was that, you asked how this should be played out in schools and in education, and perhaps I can talk about that in the question and answer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. That was incredible. If we can move to Sana as well, who's going to tell us about the research topics that interest her in her book, Indians in Kenya, and the key themes around that as well.
Thank you very much, Natasha and Amina, for inviting me to this. I'm really delighted to come here. Natasha, could you show my slides, please? Now, it's a real delight to be able to speak after Parminder Bhachu, because it really, her work on Twice Migrants was one of the first works that I came across that spoke to the research interests that I had in my own field. And much as she came to this from her personal location, I too came to this work based on being a historian who was trained across 3 different continents in South Asian history. I studied in India, in the UK, and in the US, where I did my PhD and currently teach. And as a historian of South Asia, we are really sort of bound by especially when I was a graduate student, bound by a historiography in which the nation state and the territorial boundaries around the nation state really determined what constituted South Asian history. And so South Asian history was taught as a history of, British India and its post-colonial sort of the nations that emerged after that, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, and Nepal. But this kind of a history sort of leaves out a much larger history of both colonialism and also migration that Parminder was talking about in terms of mobility, that were absolutely part and parcel of the history of 19th century colonial India and 20th century post-colonial India. And so my approach to some of this work is to think about this in terms of time, even in terms of colonial and decolonial history, as really connective history that connects different present-day nations through migrations. Close to 23 million migrants actually left from British India in the time between about 1830 and 1930 to travel across, the empire really over which the sun never set, as laborers, capitalists, pilgrims, professionals, students, teachers, and doctors. And they tended to settle in many of these places, including, of course, East Africa. And so the limits of these nationalist histories within which our programs, till today are sort of constituted, become very clear when we think about these migrants, immigrants who return to India, those who stay, those who become twice or multiple migrants. And there's a need to remap what we understand even as South Asian history. And for me, the Indian Ocean as a space of mobility really enabled doing this, because it captured both the South Asian part of history, but also the East African one. And you see that sort of on this map, there really is no land between the western coast of India and the eastern coast of the African continent. And there were, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who, got onto boats and migrated and traveled back and forth. And in order to do this research, again, we have to sort of move beyond the nationalist or even colonial archives that are located in India or just Kenya. And my research methodology brought together research done in Kenya, Britain, as well as India. And, my sort of hook into looking at the history and in a way the prehistory of what Parminder was just talking about, the prehistory of these twice migrants, was to think about diasporic consciousness and belonging. Now, what is diasporic consciousness? Parminder talked about her frustration with this idea of the myth of return, to India, which clearly was not really sort of the lived experience of the migrants that she, did her ethnographic work with. And similarly, as I began to do my research in 2004, most of the literature on diaspora, which was this sort of thriving field at the time, talked about a host land, right, that was the alien place to which migrants come, and a homeland to which there was, something of a longing, and it sort of created this sort of binary between the homeland that has been left behind and the host land that always remains somewhat sort of out of reach. But in my work, sort of, I try to think about diasporic consciousness actually as having two homelands: a civilizational homeland, that is a place that these migrants, Indian migrants came from, and also a territorial homeland, the place where they are. So, who are Indians in Kenya? What does being Indian in Kenya really mean? It really means sort of identifying in a way with two homelands simultaneously, where being Indian wasn't simply about returning to India, although there was sort of networks of trade, of marriages, of education that meant that although home was Kenya, as Parminder said, there was a lot of back and forth between India and Kenya for a variety of reasons. And so, being Indian in Kenya meant having that kind of real or imagined connection with the civilizational homeland. But the territorial homeland, the place where you are, the place where you, study, have your businesses, end up sort of, making home, really was Kenya. And this is very much a territorial homeland to which multiple generations of Indians in Kenya make a claim to belonging. But of course, it isn't quite as simple as that, right? So there's diasporic consciousness, but then there's also the diaspora, the politics of diaspora, diasporic politics, where issues of race and rights and how these get framed in the public realm became a key sort of entry point into some of the work and some of the arguments that I bring forth in my book. If being Indian in Kenya meant having both a civilizational homeland in India and a territorial homeland in Kenya, the colonial state in Kenya sort of categorized its subjects along these racial civilizational lines as well. And so, there were the Indian or Asian, as they were called, subjects of the British Empire in Kenya, who themselves have this connection with Indian, the civilizational homeland, but are also being given rights, educational spaces, business spaces on the basis of being a racial category of being Indians in Kenya. And on the other hand, there were the large majority of Africans, indigenous sort of Kenyans, the indigenous people who lived in Kenya, whose land was colonized, who were categorized again racially as African and as distinct from being Indians and sort of Europeans. So, these categories of and this sort of in a way is a migrant diasporic category. Being Indian in Kenya was a different register of politics, rights, privileges, and inequality as compared to being an Indian in India, but you're still sort of Indian. And then the third sort of lens that I bring to some of this work is to look at how the diaspora itself deployed, on the one hand, this civilization and territorial homeland to which they make claims to belong, as well as sort of these ideas of race and rights to diasporic claim making. In the context of, and my book sort of looks at the period between the 1890s and the 1960s, which really is the beginning of colonial rule in Kenya and, the first decade after decolonization, where, Indians in Kenya also shift from being subjects of the British Empire to being citizens of not one, but three, as I'll sort of talk about in a couple of minutes, three different new post-colonial nation states. And in this process of moving from being part of an empire in which borders were somewhat open at one time period to sort of beginning to really sort of, borders didn't sort of exist, right? There's this Indian Ocean sort of migration to sort of this emergence of borders around India, around Kenya and East Africa, that sort of shifts the way in which the diaspora deploys its consciousness and its politics into making particular rights, claims, and asserting particular kinds of rights from the state itself, be it the British colonial state or the Kenyan post-colonial state. And what this causes then, and this really is the heart in some ways of the book that I wrote in 2015, is sort of this interracial politics that is both a politics of friction, but also of proximity, and Parminder alluded to this, of collaboration. So I thought that I would just sort of go over very quickly, in the interest of time, the first sort of take in terms of looking at Afro-Asian relations from and to try and unpack what was this racial distance and what was the kind of friction that was created. Now, the colonial economy and the colonial state that was set up in Kenya in the early 20th century was one that was very clearly motivated by racial politics, in which there were European settlers, farmers who were at the very top of a pyramid, who were given the most rights and privileges. Below that were the Indian traders, laborers who had come in but sort of settled in Kenya, and professionals who were seen as sort of the middle level, and were absolutely sort of ended up sort of having a monopoly over retail trade in the center, in the capital, Nairobi, and other urban areas. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy were the ordinary Africans, who were relegated really to agriculture, prevented from having access to higher education, to wages, to a lot of skilled labor that the Indian laborers performed. And Parminder again talked about the success of the Indian immigrant community, both in East Africa and in Britain, sort of having organizational success and also skills. And much of this success and skills was really dependent on the networks of trade that they had set up, where because of access to both India and East Africa, traders, particularly Gujarati traders, were able to succeed based on getting loans from local Indian traders, either in Kenya or in Bombay and Karachi, getting wholesale goods, and really setting up family businesses so that you could be in debt with your own brother-in-law or father. And this sort of diasporic family-based businesses were really the key to their success in East Africa. So what this meant was that the Indians were, shopkeepers who sold goods, everyday commodities. You see an image of that, bicycle wheels, clothes, oil, foodstuff, to predominantly African, and in this case, sort of Kikuyu customers. And of course, like all businessmen wanting to make a profit and really having a monopoly over setting the price, because across the Indian bazaar in Nairobi, for example, it would all be Indian stores, and they would simply decide amongst themselves not to sell a particular good for a lower price so that everyone comes out okay. So this, of course, is an absolute bone of contention for the African customers, who feel very much the pinch of the colonial tax system and the colonial economy, aren't able to really make inroads into this retail business. And in many ways, the Indian shopkeepers are the immediate face of the colonial state for them, because it's to them that they take their agricultural produce to be able to sell their potatoes, for example, or their maize to the Indian shopkeeper, and then also have to buy their everyday goods from that shopkeeper. So that was really absolutely the point of friction. And along with sort of these business networks, the way in which social and cultural norms were preserved were again through intra-race, intra-community marriages. And so again, the sort of idea of what it means to be an Indian, what is Indian civilization, also sort of shows itself in spaces like the Sikh Gurudwara here in Nairobi, where again it's a community that is forming, that's organizing itself, but it does then exclude those who are not the Africans in particular. And right through the early 20th century, these Indian shopkeepers, particularly the elite from amongst this community, assert their rights to try and get more equality with European settlers on the basis of being imperial citizens, and saying, we are members of the British Empire, or we are proud members of this. We come from the jewel of the crown, India, and India really is our civilizational homeland. We are more civilized, in fact, than the Africans, and therefore we should get access to representation, political representation, better education, and things like that. So that immediately, of course, causes racial distance between the Indians and the Africans. But this isn't the entire story, and it becomes quite clear from the 1920s onwards. The European settlers weren't interested in giving the Indians, even the most elite, highly educated, propertied Indians, any such equality at all. And the idea at the same time, African politics, particularly Kikuyu politics, begins to organize itself in the form of resistance, of anti-colonial politics, right through the 1920s and from the 1920s to the 1950s. And the basis of this, the identity right around this is, of course, Indian and Kikuyu. But in all the material that I read, especially the newspapers and the reports of public meetings, a phrase kept coming up: non-European people, right? And this was a way in which it was a kind of entry point for Indian and African individual activists, workers, and organizations to find a way of being both Indian but also allying with their African compatriots or other colonial subjects who were non-European people who were facing racial discrimination. Indian independence in 1947 and partition plays a big role in the politics of diasporic claim making. India begins to really assert herself as the leader of the colonized world. Now that India had got freedom, its idea was to really help much of Asia and Africa to gain that freedom. And by 1950 in Kenya, the very first public call for complete independence and sovereignty takes place in Nairobi in 1950. And something that even Kenyan sort of historians have missed is that very first call was made at a public meeting of the two main Indian and Kenyan African political organizations. And it was a man, Makhan Singh, who you see in the bottom left photograph, who actually raised the call for complete independence at this meeting. Makhan Singh himself had been a part of a labor trade union. He had organized Indian Sikh workers in Nairobi and Mombasa, and right from the 1940s onwards had been really conscious about allying with African workers as well, and met with a fair amount of success there. By 1950, in fact, he's arrested right after he makes this speech and thrown into jail, and for having made seditious speeches. And at that point, the Mau Mau rebellion, which was a predominantly Kikuyu anti-colonial sort of movement, breaks out, and most of the political leadership of the Kenyan African organization is immediately arrested and detained. And during this period, an emergency was declared in Kenya that lasted up till 1959. And during this time period, it was Indian journalists, lawyers, as well as some Indian activists who were detained, who really took up the cause of the Mau Mau rebels, not so much talking about the agrarian sort of peasant demands, but in fact talking about the need for independence. And in fact, India sends across a lawyer to fight the defense case of Jomo Kenyatta, who you see here in the bottom right photograph, who was arrested very early on and went on to become independent Kenya's first prime minister and president. And it's in this, this is just sort of one or two examples of all these moments of political proximity and interracial solidarity that I found during my research, would really sort of help me argue that Kenya was absolutely the territorial homeland for Indians in this political mode. And at the time, right through the 1950s, this idea of non-European people, which was not a racially bound idea, nor a territorially nationalist bound idea, allowed for interracial solidarity. And right on top, you see another photograph of, a mass sort of mobilization demanding equality for all races. But things do fall apart, as you'll be hearing about, in a couple of minutes from Ian. Things fall apart at the moment of independence. And in some ways, I think of this, the expulsions and the voluntary exodus of Indians from Kenya as a long process of decolonization that really sort of makes us understand that colonialism doesn't end with independence, that decolonization is not one particular moment, but there are these long afterlives of colonialism that that the Indian community, as well as sort of Kenyans in African Kenyans in East Africa, reckon with till today. Now, independence comes to India and Kenya, the two homelands, over a gap of about 15 to 20 years. And we think of India and Kenya as post-colonial states, but actually Britain, the United Kingdom, also in a way becomes a post-colonial state after decolonization. And citizenship, how, who gives you your passport, how immigration is going to be controlled, who is allowed in and who is allowed out, who is not going to be allowed in, who is a citizen, is being determined by India, Pakistan, Kenya, and the UK over a period of about 2 decades. And the Indians in Kenya are really caught up in this. We see here a photograph of Indians celebrating Uhuru or independence in 1963, holding Kenyan flags, smiling along with their African compatriots. On the bottom left hand, you see the Kenyan Olympics team of 1968, and right at the bottom you see the hockey team, predominantly Sikh Indian, who are being feted and celebrated by Jomo Kenyatta. On the other hand, as Parminder had sort of briefly mentioned, there was a sense in Kenya that, what does the Kenyan nation, the post-colonial nation, really look like? And there's a singularity of belonging that comes into the idea of nationhood and citizenship, which really excludes Indians. And this singularity of belonging is simultaneously racial in the sense of an idea that, Africa should be for Africans, and there's a process of Africanization that begins to sort of squeeze Indians out of their jobs in the government services initially, and then in trade. It's a very singular in a territorial sense. So both India and Kenya announced that you can't have dual citizenship, that you only have to be a citizen of either India or Kenya. And so, sort of the options of this migrant community begin to get limited. And Britain is doing the same at the same time, trying to reckon with what does post-colonial Britain look like in terms of its citizenship, in terms of the passports, in fact, that were given to members or, British subjects of the empire and the UK, but also singularity in a historical sense. And, there were statesmen in Kenya who said, Indians came with the colonial project. They have done better than us in education, in jobs, in terms of their access to retail and trade. And real decolonization means that Africans have to get priority to correct the past colonialism's wrongs. And that while the British might have left, the Indians are still here. They are the obstacle to us getting real freedom and real equality. And that's what then sets up a series of legislations that trigger the exodus or expulsion of Indians from Kenya into Britain in 1968-69. And I just wanted to end by saying that we think about sort of the expulsions or the exodus in 68-69 and the arrival into Britain as sort of the end of this story, the end of sort of the story of Indians in Kenya. But in fact, a larger majority of Indians stayed in Kenya than left. And in 2018, almost exactly 50 years after the exodus of Indians from Kenya, the Constitution of Kenya, and the president, who is in fact Jomo Kenyatta's son, announced that Indians were in fact the 44th tribe. Asians were the 44th tribe of Kenya, which absolutely asserts Asian belonging in Kenya at the moment. So although those who left in 1968, and as you heard in the previous presentation and we'll be hearing in the next presentation, sort of leave and settle in Britain with their skills and set up their community. In fact, there are these longer histories of connection and connection to Kenya that I think would be quite interesting for future historians and community activists to actually explore between that link up Britain and Kenya as well. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sana. That was incredible. That was such a comprehensive overview as well. And I think if we move over to Ian, who's written a book, We're Here Because You Were There. Now, I've heard this phrase quoted so many times, particularly in the literature circles as well, when we're trying to talk about identity and belonging. And it's such an honor to have you here. It's an absolute pleasure. We'd love to hear about why your research topics interest you, and we'd love to hear a bit more about your book as well. I believe you've got some slides for us, so I shall add those to the stream.
Thank you so much, Natasha.
No, you're very welcome. And I shall remove everybody else.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and particularly to to speak after Parminder and Sana, and anybody who's working in the field of historical scholarship on East African South Asians is really standing on the shoulders of Parminder and Sana's work, as will be very clear. So it's really a delight, really, to speak after them. This is the cover of the book that Natasha referred to that I just published. It came out a couple of months ago with Verso, and it picks up really a particular part of the story of East African Asians and focuses in particular on the migration that Sana just alluded to, particularly around 1968 in Kenya and 1972 in Uganda. And really what I was trying to do in this book was to draw I think we all know that there's an intuitive connection between empire and migration in this context, but really trying to bring out what exactly that meant. And of course, a lot of the migrations that Sana and Parminder were discussing from South Asia are happening under the auspices of the British Empire. Now, of course, South Asian migration to East Africa in particular predates the British Empire, but a lot of indentured laborers, and then other kinds of migrants were coming under the auspices of the British Empire. And then, of course, the post-war Commonwealth is very important for determining how and when South Asians in East Africa are able or not to enter the UK. And one thing in particular that I'll sort of try to focus on for you, and I'll try to be brief, is particularly looking at what Sana was describing, in the sense that these people, the South Asians in East Africa, were in a very unique position. They had they were ancestrally connected to South Asia. Obviously, they were residents in East Africa, and their legal citizenship was not clear. Sometimes their legal homeland was in Britain, sometimes it was in Kenya or Uganda, and other times a smaller minority of people had carried Indian or Pakistani citizenship. So let's see if I can break this down for you a little bit further. So here we have a slide proclaiming the British Nationality Act in 1948. And this is actually a key piece of legislation for this story of the South Asians in East Africa, because what this legislation did was that it recodified the rights of the British subject in the post-war world. Now, what this did more specifically is that it gave people who were born in British colonies, so for example, Kenya colony, a very generous scheme of citizenship rights, including the right to migrate and live and work in the UK. And you can see here that the New York Times reacts to the 1948 Act by declaring that the British Empire gets a new Nationality Act. So this is even though we're in the post-war period and India's just gained independence, this is still a scheme of British nationality which is imperial. So the South Asians who were born in Kenya are now carrying the same kind of citizenship as somebody born in London or Leeds. Now, when we move forward to the 1960s, things are very different. So when the British passed the 1948 British Nationality Act, there was very little understanding that there would be a mass migration of people from places like Jamaica and India to the UK. And in the 1960s, the British started to pass immigration laws which were designed to stop what they called coloured immigration. That was the term that was used at the time. And in particular, there was a piece of legislation passed in 1968 called the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which was directly targeting Kenyan South Asian citizens of the UK and colony. So these are full British citizens who have an unrestricted right to migrate to the UK before this act came in. Now, even though the act is called the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, it's uniquely misnamed because these are actually, as I say, citizens of the UK and colony. So they have an identical citizenship to the Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson. Now, through the legal provisions of the Act, which don't directly turn on race, they actually technically turn on territory. In practice, only people with an ancestral connection to Britain are able to enter the UK unrestricted. So this actually means that a lot of the Kenyan South Asian citizens of the UK and colonies, which is over 100,000, are left without being able to make use of one of the primary functions of a nationality, which is the right to live and work in your own country. And this was a remarkable thing to do because of the violation, the human rights violations that the Act contained, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And as Sana was indicating, this put the Kenyan South Asians in a very difficult position. And as you can see, the Home Secretary at the time, James Callaghan, who went on to become Prime Minister in the 1970s, he was well aware of what this legislation was doing to Kenyan South Asians who wanted to migrate to the UK, which was their right. And of course, this is happening in the context of Africanization, which Sana very helpfully set out for us. So here you can see James Callaghan explaining exactly what this legislation was going to do. It was not going to leave them stateless per se, he says, but we are leaving them with no more than the husk of citizenship. And you can see here further down in the document, he's worried about any number of international agreements. These are international human rights agreements that the legislation might be violating. Now, this was a remarkable thing to do, as I say, and it led to a sort of minor constitutional crisis. And I've been going through the archives of British officials at this time, and you do find some remarkable things. So, for example, the British were more concerned with white settlers who were connected to Britain, who were also a minority amid Africanization, than they were with South Asian citizens who, as I say, had full British citizenship. And so here you can see that British officials, before the act was passed, were worried that how could they pass an act which would exclude the Kenyan South Asians from entering the UK, but would actually allow what they call white British, which has been scribbled out, and an official was written, expatriate Britons on top. How would it allow them to return, but also keep the South Asians out? And that was the particular nature of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1968, that it allowed both to take place. It kept South Asians out who were resident in Kenya, but allowed certain white British to return if they had the appropriate ancestral connections. Now, as you can see, this immediately led to accusations of racial discrimination, and this is a very interesting time for human rights and racial discrimination in the 1960s. And it was very clear that what the British had done was a very serious act. And yeah, this is actually a clipping from a New York Times article, which is talking about a protest of South Asians in the UK who led a protest to Downing Street on the eve of the act to protest it coming into power. And it also led to fallout in terms of British-Indian relations. So British officials in private were trying to persuade Indira Gandhi's government to take in for permanent settlement Kenyan South Asian British citizens. And Indira Gandhi's government did indeed take in a few thousand, but tended not to publicize it because this might appear as a capitulation to Britain's attempt to keep out its own citizens. And as you can see here, Indian politicians at the time were calling it blatant racial legislation. Now, the episode of the Kenyan South Asians is one thing, and then, of course, we have a different situation in 1972 in Uganda, and of course we should at least mention in passing that of course there are South Asians in places like Tanzania as well, and there's a slightly different trajectory there. Now, what's interesting with the Ugandan South Asians, who are of course subject to Idi Amin's expulsion order in 1972, is that they are also, of course, a minority in Uganda's population, and they are also a very complicated mixture of different kinds of legal citizenship. Some of them are Ugandan citizens who have their citizenship stripped of them through administrative means by Idi Amin's officials. A minority of them are Indian citizens, and a few of them, too, a great number, are either British protected persons, because Uganda was a protectorate, not a colony, and also some of them, too, were full British citizens. And you know, this sort of reality of the kind of passport you held often would dictate the fate of many families' lives in quite remarkable ways. And of course, there are great differences in the Kenya episode and the Uganda episode. But still, as Sana was talking about, there's still this inevitable demarcation and difficulty where you're ancestrally connected to one place, South Asia. You're resident in East Africa amid new citizenship laws, and often your legal connection is to the UK. Now, it's not very well known in Britain, but actually the case of particularly Kenyan South Asians actually ended up in the European Court of Human Rights in 1973. And I wish that this case was better known and better understood, because the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the 1968 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which is targeting Kenyan South Asians, was an example of racial discrimination and a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And this just shows you exactly what Britain was prepared to do on the altar of immigration control. And, you know, the strange thing is, of course, that, you know, many thousands of East African South Asians were able to enter the UK through a voucher system set up under the 1968 legislation, where you could come in as a so-called head of household, and then you were then entitled to family reunification. This was the case for my father, actually, and you were able to bring over the rest of your family. So even though Britain did pass these acts, it never abolished the right of family reunification, which actually meant that by the 1970s, by 1974, you actually had over 100,000 East African South Asians resident in Britain. And I think today, even among the Gujarati community, there's something like 600,000 people, at least half of whom come from families from East Africa. So I hope that gives you a sense of some of the legal and citizenship complexities around this bigger story that Parminder and Sana told us about. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm just going to add everybody back to the stream, so give me a moment. Thank you so much. I think particularly as well, there's a lot of, I think for a lot of us, there's so many members of the diaspora that have family history rooted in twice migrant history. And although we are aware of some of the things, particularly with reference to the events in August 1972, it's not really something that's typically spoken about on the interpersonal level. And a lot of us have spoken about this before, and I know that Saz and Sneha and I have spoken about this before, whereby it's been referenced in family and it's been referenced in community, where you ask where people are from, and you always know somebody, and you know people who have family that either lives in or has come from Africa, but we don't actually interrogate the history around this. We don't talk about these awful things that have happened, and really investigate what has happened there, and commemorate what has happened there as well. With that in mind, I just wanted to come to Saz and Sneha, really. So Saz, you were born in East Africa and you moved to the United Kingdom in the 60s. You moved to Coventry. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your childhood and about your family?
My parents came from Tanzania. My father left India straight after partition because he was based in Karachi. My grandfather was in East Africa, coming to and fro from Tanzania to Karachi to the Gujarat. Jamnagar is where the state is. It's where my family come from. So there was always that kind of obviously my family are those kind of twice migrants. They went off at all sorts of different directions and didn't bother and didn't think that there was anything wrong with that. So when Tanzania became independent, which was 1961, there was discussion of not providing, because my father had British citizenship, it was all about working, although we had what's known as a dukan, a shop that provided clothing, because that's what my family background is. My father had the inkling that things were going to get worse, and so decided that rather than stay in Tanzania, he took us, all of us, back to India to try and resettle in India, which was in 1960. At the end of 1965, he stayed there for a few months and decided that that's not what he was going to do. And then moved across to come to England, where he already had friends that had settled in Leicester, and he had a very close friend that had settled in Coventry. So then he decided that he was going to come to Coventry. He settled in Coventry, and then we stayed in India, in Jamnagar, for probably about 9 months, and then we came in 1967. So my early history, memories of coming to England was very different from everyone else's. I could speak English fluently. I had no difficulty in communicating with people at school. So when I was when I started junior school and I was told to explain where I was, the first thing I said was, "Oh, my name is Saroj Wagela. I was born in Tanzania. I was born in Tanganyika, which is what it was, and now called Tanzania." And people were like, "How come she can speak English?" So I had quite a lot of that, which was different, because the people where I settled, we settled in Fosler, which is a very predominantly Asian area in Coventry. Lots of Punjabis from India had settled there, and we were settled there. So I was kind of, I found it really strange that there were people that were there who were Indian but didn't know how to speak English, but there were people who were English who spoke English but looked at me as if I was some really strange person. But as Parminder was saying, when we came, there were quite a few of us that knew each other, and because we all came from East Africa, there's this thing about a community. So there was a community centre. We all managed to meet up as a community, regardless of our caste and our religion. It was very different from what happened later when sort of 68, 70s onward, when Kenya did decide to, and lots of Kenyans did leave because of 1968. But straight after the Rivers of Blood speech with Enoch Powell, things started changing for me and my family, but also for the people that were in Africa. They all decided that you either have to come, and there was, probably Ian knows more about this with the Kenya Act, that there's so many people did then decide that they were going to pop over and stay here. One of the things that was quite interesting is that there were children that from Tanzania that had already come over here to study anyway, were at university, and loads of my family friends, not necessarily relatives, but I would call them cousins because they were like my uncle and aunt's children, stayed. And then the rest of the family could come because of that family link, the fact that the British government wasn't allowing families to come here. And I've always wanted to kind of talk and actually explain that I am different. I'm not the girl that was forced into marriage. I'm not the girl that was discouraged to not go to university, because I went to university in the 80s, early 80s. My parents didn't say, oh, no, you can't go away, because the whole point is education for my parents' generation, because they were in East Africa. They were sending children off to either go to university to India, or they were sending children to come to university to England, regardless of whether you were a boy or a girl. There was no differentiation. So I wanted to write, and that's what I did. I thought, you know what, I'm going to write a story about me as a Gujarati and as an East African. And I talk a lot about my East African background, because I went to India the first time ever after living here for quite a long time. My parents went every couple of years, but they never took us there. We went to holiday to Europe and holiday around England. I went to India and in the 80s, and we were talking, my sister and I were talking and trying to explain to my aunt and my massis that lived there about something. And they just looked at us blankly and went, that's not a Gujarati word. And I was going, but it is, it's the word we've been using a long time. No, that's Swahili. And it was only then that it kind of hit me that I was speaking this really gobbledygooky pidgin English. You know, obviously people could understand English and they could understand my Gujarati, but they just couldn't understand my Swahili. So that was when I actually realized that I am very different to the migrants that, the other first migrants that live here. And then there's this thing about migrant stories, migrant struggle. They find it difficult. They build homes, they send money back. And as Parminder was saying, my father was one of those that bought a house, put central heating in the 70s. And everyone was going, oh my God, why are you spending all that much money? But the point is, because he'd been in Africa for such a long time, and his father had been in Africa for such a long time, they adopted technology, anything that came up. They were really full on, we need to invest money. We're going to be here for a long time. It wasn't like we do send money off, but there's nobody there in India to send money to. Most of it was, we're here. We'll send money to people who are struggling if they want to buy houses or education. But the rest of it was, we're here. This is where we're going to be. We were in Africa. We're now going to be here.
Thank you so much for sharing. So there really is a difference in experience, and I think that often what we tend to do with migration and migrant stories is that Britain is the end point, and I think that often what's lost in this story is this community of twice and multiple migrants within the South Asian community, and really it is a story of a different kind of resilience, of having your home broken and remade twice over. That is a completely different experience than the rest of us. And like you say, there are words and behaviors and characteristics that all arise out of that are completely nuanced and completely different. And that is something to be recognized and remembered, but also celebrated, all of that nuance and texture. Just before I ask you how that's informed your writing, I'd just like to jump over to Sneha. Hi, Sneha. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you. I'm very well, thank you. It's great to hear some of the academics speak about this history, which is fascinating to me. And I wish I'd grown up with people like you who'd written those books. and more from our lens. So thanks very much for sharing. So I grew up with a very romanticized view of East African Indians. My family would sit around and I'd hear them speak about their movement from East Africa to the UK. But prior to that, I'd ask a lot more questions. So my grandparents migrated from Gujarat in India in the 1940s, early 1940s, to Kenya. My grandfather first, and was followed by my grandmother in 1945 on a sailboat with her baby and toddler, which took over 2 weeks to arrive. Some people didn't make that journey or complete that journey during that time. So to hear that story and really delve deeper into that migration, that initial migration, was very interesting for me growing up. And they settled in a small town called Kitale in Kenya. This town was pretty missable back then. If you were to drive through it, you wouldn't really know that you're there. And they built a cafe and really started from scratch in this town. My father was the first to be born there within the family and was one of 9 children. But one thing that when I hear the stories, especially from him, is that he grew up not with just the Gujarati Hindu community, but he had Goan best friends who were Christian. He had Sindhi friends, Punjabi, Sikh, Muslim friends, and they would live side by side, and they lived in a unity where they would attend one another's functions and would actually play music there and join in and participate, and also speak one another's languages fluently. And even now, if I meet some of the Punjabi community who lived in Kitale with my father, they speak to me in perfect Gujarati, and it's just so interesting to hear that when I speak to these people. And I think that's one of the key things, that it was through this shared experience that they felt a real strong unity, and they brought that over when they came here to Britain. And that's one of the things that I'm really exploring in the book that is due to come out next year, Britain. And it's really those micro stories and those real life stories of people's experience, everyday lives, both through the migration to Kenya and the life in Kenya, but also here in Britain and those early days settling and building those successful businesses that you all spoke about so well. I feel like we were a confident migrant group who had done it once. We felt fully British when we did that in East Africa, and therefore we're able to pack up and do so again here. And therefore now we are sort of known as one of the most successful migrant communities here in Britain. We saw the gaps that needed to be filled, and we were able to do so with that confidence, with our head down, and with hard work and grit. And I do think that that's a really key part of the research that I've done. Interestingly, when I've sat with a lot of these people and spoken to them and asked them questions, they almost laugh that I want to have these conversations and talk about that. They just see it as life, but for them it's just part of what they grew up with and what they lived. But if we don't capture these stories now, they will be lost with these individuals, and that's something that's really crucial to me. And that's why this book is really about capturing that, both from the Kenyan migration stories, the Ugandan experience, which is completely different, and really some of the stories are very tragic, what I've heard and written about. And really watching these stories unfold and looking at now our privilege in society as their children and grandchildren, and understanding that I've only got the opportunity to write today because they worked hard and built and really allowed for me to have that education to be able to write today. So it's really a lot that we owe to them, and I want my son and the next generation to be able to carry that forward and to understand where they came from and why we have what we have and why we fit within society where we do. So I think that's kind of crucial element that I wanted to bring up today.
That's so beautifully said. Thank you so much for sharing. And when is your book out next year?
So I'm actually due to have a baby very soon. So it's been delayed slightly. Thank you. It's been delayed slightly. So it will be sort of spring next year.
Love that. Please do check back in with us when it is, and we will feature it and have another discussion around this issue, because I just think it's extraordinary, and it sounds like there's been extensive research as well, and so many personal conversations and so much data gathering, which I just think is key here. And like you say, if we are not the curators of our own history, if we are not the curators of our own stories and our own past, it will disappear. It will absolutely disappear. And that's the case for partition. That is the case for these microcosm communities within the wider South Asian story, the wider canon of our history as well. And if, I absolutely applaud all of you for doing this, for actually digging down into our collective experience and helping us hold on to it as best we can. With that in mind, I'd like to come to Amina, Vice Chair of Partition Education Group. Hi, Amina, how are you doing? Oh, you're on mute.
Right, we've got there in the
end. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey everyone. No, it's been so great to sit here. I mean, I've pretty much been an audience member this whole time. I didn't know much at all about the extensive and rich history and heritage that exists between Indians and Africans. This concept of twice migrants I only came across about a month ago, actually, when Natasha and I sort of discussed this event. And I've sat here and I've just been absorbing and learning so much from each and every one of you. I think you've all brought something completely different to this event, completely different perspectives, your personal experiences, coming over to the UK, fitting in but also not fitting in, and all these similarities and differences between Indians, between Africans, between everyone in between. And it's definitely given me a lot to think about. And I hope to continue learning about this topic in the future as well. And that kind of brings me on to sort of why I'm here today, and why, as the Partition Education Group, we sort of went ahead and decided to collaborate on this event centered around twice migrants and South Asian African history. So the Partition Education Group was set up in 2018. We're a group of various people: academics, educators, community representatives, museum representatives, archive representatives. And our goal was to essentially work towards the inclusion of South Asian history within education, and specifically in the UK. As we all know, our history is not seen enough within the classrooms. I don't think it's even a question, it's a fact. And it's something that more and more people are demanding for, particularly within the UK. Now, when the group started, we very quickly realized this was more than just changing one national curriculum that exists within the UK. This is more than just writing a few lessons about partition, taking it to the government and asking them to put it within education. Actually, several months ago, there was a debate in Parliament about diversifying the curriculum, and it didn't go down so well, and we sort of concluded that we don't really have the support from the government that we'd be looking for, which is why one thing that we're working towards now is to develop a set of our own teaching resources in line for the 75th anniversary of partition next year. And we're working towards putting together a set of 5 lessons for primary education and for secondary education as well. And these will be focused around partition. This is a topic that we do feel that the need to include in schools. And alongside that as well, we also aim to use our platform to host events like this to educate people on topics such as partition. We actually had an event earlier today as well around an introduction to partition, but also explore other areas of South Asian history as well, such as today, which I'll get onto in a little bit. But we've also got our website in which we've shared a lot of different teaching resources already out there. We've also got a reading list that we've promoted as well. But we want to use our platform to educate the public. And what we find is that there's so many adults that are so unaware. And I'm talking about white adults, middle-aged people in the UK who hardly even know that India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were once one country. It's shocking when I come across someone who tells me, oh yeah, I didn't realize India and Pakistan used to be the same country until like a year ago. It's so shocking. And the key to changing this, and the key to having a better understanding, a better representation, more inclusion of our own people and our own communities, it all starts in the classroom. It all starts with young people. And it's so, so important that young people within the classroom feel more represented. They need to see themselves within the lessons that they're sat in, within the curriculum, within their education. And sort of that is our goal here. And we have our short-term goal, which is to include partition within education. But also moving on to why we're sat here today discussing South Asian African history, we very much recognize that South Asian history is much more than just partition. And it's very easy for people to associate partition as being the only thing that exists within South Asian history. I should mention at this point, this isn't just South Asian history, this is shared British history as well. And so we've recognized that when we talk about including South Asian history and better representing our entire South Asian community within the UK in our education system, this is much more than just partition. This goes way beyond partition. There is so much more rich history that we have that we need to share. And the perfect example, which is why we're here today, is the complex Indian African history that exists. There are so many young people sat in classrooms with this exact heritage. You know, speakers today, you've spoken about your experiences. And these young people deserve to see themselves within the classrooms that they're sat in, within the education system that they're working through. I've had a few conversations with friends recently even who didn't even know that there are so many people in the UK with Indian African heritage. They had no idea. I was explaining to them, we're doing this event around this really, really interesting history. And they had no idea. And this is the problem, that we have to take the initiative ourselves to go out and learn about history that is very much our own. And this is what we're working to change at the Partition Education Group. And this is why our wider long-term goals are not only to see partition within the classroom, but also to work on developing teaching resources and learning materials that cover wider South Asian history, for example, this history that we've discussed today. So I guess I'd like to, I'll wrap up with a question actually that I'd really, really love everyone here to answer today. I know there's a lot of us, so if everyone could take 2 to 3 minutes to sort of sum up their thoughts on this, I know it's difficult, but do you feel we need to be teaching more South Asian history within our education systems? How is it that, how does South Asian African history serve as an example of a topic we should be exploring within the classroom outside of partition, given there are so many young people sat in classrooms with this heritage from South Asia and from Africa as well? And is this the key for better inclusion and representation of our communities within society? So I guess, shall we start with Parminder and then sort of work across the screen?
Just before we go to the answers for this question, just for everybody watching as well, your questions and comments are welcome. I know there's been a couple that have come through already, and we will get through to them at the end, but do feel free to ask questions and we will try our best to fit you in also. Sorry, carry on, Amina, take it away.
Oh yeah, no, so I guess Parminder, should we start with you and then we can work across the screen? I think if we start with this question, looking at the education side of things, then we can move on to some of the questions we've had in the comments, which are really, really interesting.
Yeah. Can you hear me? I think my mic is on. You can
yes,
hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that, you know, underneath Natasha's email, I think it's something like we need to tell our stories. Don't you have something, a slogan?
Our stories matter. Yeah.
Yes. You know, our stories matter. I mean, you know, Mira Nair says that if we don't tell our own stories, no one else will. It is so important to tell our story. I mean, you know, as I was listening to Sneha, I thought that, you know, she talks about how in Kitale, people had friends across borders and, you know, they could speak each other's languages fluently. This is also reflected in the cuisine. And that model of collaborating, of knowing each other is something that I talk about in my Movers and Makers book, which came out around the time that Ian's book came out, a couple of months ago, and that the sort of the connections that these people had are so significant in the ways in which people operate. I mean, there's always this talk that there's lots of divisions within amongst Asians, and so we need to recapture that narrative of people who lived. I mean, if you see some of the early temple building, you see that when they're putting down the first stone, they're Muslims and Hindus and all kinds of people who did it together, and there was a great deal of that, collaboration across communities. So it's a way of contesting how Indians were represented. I mean, Sana's talk referred to the role of Makhan Singh. I mean, for me, when I read her book, that was so significant. The notion that Ahuru Sasa, that there should be independence now, is so significant. Without the trade union movement, decolonization was not possible. So it's the son of, he was a craftsman's son, that he and his father had a printing press, and, you could do the propaganda. The Gadar movement in San Francisco was using their printing press, the access to communication. So why don't we know about Makhan Singh? Why is it not taught in schools? Why do we not know the significance of Indians' political interventions? And the other thing, the reason I think it's so important to teach South Asian history in schools, whether it's African or African Asians or not, is also because the narrative that the British perpetuated and promoted, which in lots of ways needs to be dented. I mean, as Sana talked, the shopkeepers, the Gujaratis, were often the interface between the Africans and the Indians. But Indians have been trading in East Africa, the Indian Ocean trade, since, 3 BC or 9 BC. They never conquered. They traded, but they never conquered. And if you look at the British, they owned the White Highlands, the best land, the most land that belonged to the Kikuyus. The best land went to those people. They were the ones who colonized and took up resources. But the blame is often it was the Indians who were exploitative. What about the British, who not only exploited, but they actually captured land and so on and so forth? I mean, that's, that there is a certain discourse that is used, and that discourse has, the people who are perpetuating that discourse have their own interests. And also, the trade in the 19th century, that Indians were there trading in East Africa much before the British came along. These were people. The rupee was the currency of East Africa. The British did not like the fact that Indians had a monopoly over entrepreneurship, and they dented that. I mean, I think that's actually very well known. And we also never talk. What people need to know about is the infrastructure, the building of the colonies, and in East Africa was exactly by this group of craftsmen who came to East Africa. I mean, this is a very significant group. And Glenn Adamson writes this wonderful book on how, whilst there's a focus on the Constitution of the US, the people who built the US, who built the infrastructure, were also these craftsmen. So there was a great deal of inputting, of giving, of using your skill. Without the infrastructure, no community is possible. And also, we also don't know that these people who had these skills actually trained local Africans. There's a whole artisanal class that's entirely been trained by Indian artisans. So, there's all the exploitation narrative. So our children, our progeny need to know that background, that it wasn't just about trade and entrepreneurship, that there were many things going on. The role of the trade union movement, the building of the infrastructure, and there's a whole range of information that we need to have, which should be taught in schools. It should be known. And the other thing I also wanted to mention was that the historical aspect. Where did Jayabane Desai's, who was fought in the Grundtvig, the strike? I mean, you see this small woman in saris who was so critical in the interventions that she made. Another link with the trade union movement, the political skills, etc. So I am very, absolutely for a teaching of South Asian African history, South Asian history, from the perspectives of people who write about it, like Ian, who belongs to a different generation from me, but they come from a very different angle, and that's information we need. And also, I needed to say in my talk that in terms of my earlier presentation, in terms of migration history, one of the things that even I did not know when I wrote about Twice Migrants, that in fact the migration trajectories of many Twice Migrants is much more complex than Twice Migrants. I'll give you an example. My grandfather moved from Punjab to Shanghai. From Shanghai, he went to Yokohama and learned the very fine woodwork techniques of the Japanese. He worked on the inside of those, late 19th century, early 20th century ships, which is very elaborate. From Yokohama, he goes to Malaysia. From Malaysia, he goes to Basra in Iraq, and then comes to Kenya. So the Twice Migrants, already Twice Migrants. I mean, the significance of Sana's work, that there is a historical perspective. When I wrote Twice Migrants, it was about the British community. And, I had no inclination that they were deep-rooted migration history. So all that we need to know that all these things are much more complex than we think. And one of the things that one of the speakers talked about was how much we need to. I think it was you, Natasha. We need to capture the stories of these grandfathers, and because in the recent book I've done, it was a surprise to me how much some of the people I write about appreciate the fact that their grandparents took the risk. And because they took the risk, they have enormous admiration for them because they took a risk. The current generation can take higher levels of risk. That's very, very significant. You need to know the stories of the past to be able to function in the present, because the past is so present in the present.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. Very powerfully said as well. I don't know how everyone can see the windows, but I see Sneha next.
Thank you. So I was searching and yearning for our history growing up. I was a history student and was kind of looking for the right path for me, apart from the oral history that I received at home, luckily, and really grounded me in that space. So at 15, I knew I wanted to go to the School of Oriental and African Studies to study history and with South Asian studies. And I went on to do that with great aspirations that this is going to fulfill everything for me. Unfortunately, I was marked down in my first year purely because I was writing from our perspective and was using sources that I'd found, probably people like you, Parminder, within my work. And I saw very quickly that I needed to fit within that colonial perspective to receive the grades to get me through. So I changed my style and went ahead and did that. So the reason I tell you that is because sadly, I still think that that's the case. This is 17 years ago or so. But I think unless we are the creators and are not sitting on the sidelines and watching our history being written for us, have more people that go into the arts and, from our communities and are willing to share. There are a lot more platforms like podcasts coming out where people are sharing this type of history, which is great. But I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to make it accessible to not just the academics, but also to the general public. So that's something crucial that I wanted to say. And I think this, as I said previously, this is the tipping point, that now is the time for our communities to really to start doing that. And I think this next decade, if it's not done then, we're going to lose a lot of that oral history and a lot of the stories that need to be captured. So if we don't do it now, it won't be there for the next generation.
if I could jump in there really quickly before we move on to Sana, I think we'll come to you next. But I realized when I was speaking, I didn't actually give my own perspective, which was that I graduated from uni last year, and my background was actually a chemistry degree, right? So I don't come from the world of South Asian history at all whatsoever. Now, for those wondering why I'm sat here representing the Partition Education Group as their vice chair, it's been several years of uncovering and learning about my own history. And that started while I was at university. Very coincidentally, I was sat with a friend having a coffee, and we started talking about our grandparents' experiences of partition. So my granddad moved from the India side to the Pakistan side, and then later to the UK. Both of my granddads did that, actually. And aside from, again, hearing the oral histories that I heard from home, after prompting my granddads to sit down with me and tell me about their history, you know, one of them, it took him 2 weeks to reach the UK from Pakistan. He was on a ship with hundreds and hundreds of people, and he went through France and Italy and all these other European countries just to get to the UK. You know, their stories are much more exciting than my life today. But it was from that conversation with a friend, we ended up, long story short, we ended up setting up a project called Project Dastan. Some of you might have heard of it. A project essentially to reconnect partition witnesses back with their ancestral homes, because my friends' grandparents, they made the opposite journey from Pakistan to India. And we realized very quickly that our grandparents' journeys were very, very similar. And they all sort of had a final wish, you could say, to sort of see their childhood homes again. So again, cutting a very, very long story short, I had to take the initiative entirely on my own, prompted by a curiosity that most people, not most people, a lot of people don't actually have because they're too busy in the world that they're in. But I had to take my own steps to go out and learn about my own history. Can I add, in the UK, you know, a history that is very much part of British history, about South Asian history, and history that impacts South Asians within Britain today. Partition marked the end of empire. It explains so much regarding Britain and where it is today politically and in terms of its society that we live in. And for me, I had to take my own steps to find that history. And that is something that we need to change, because here I am again today, only after helping to sort of organize this event, am I learning more and more about Indian African history. And adding to Sneha's point about accessibility for information as well, I found it quite hard while learning more about partition to find information that was very accessible for myself, given that I had a very basic understanding. When I first started learning about partition, it was quite overwhelming. And it took a lot of work to learn more about the history and kind of find the correct sources of information as well, that wasn't biased by one side or dominated by one side, that gave you a good overview, but also didn't paint the British in a really, really positive light, because some sources of information do in the UK. So it was really difficult to find that information. And bringing it back to this discussion, that's why we're here sort of talking about why it is that we need better inclusion of South Asian history within the classroom, right from when young people are in school, not years later when they stumble upon the information themselves.
Exactly.
So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. To piece together, it should not be. It is up to us to hold on to it now, but we're holding on to it now because it is not embedded in the curriculum, because it is not deemed important enough to embed in the social and national conscience, and that really is a narrative that we need to change. That really is where we need to move the needle on this, because it is, as you've said before, Amina, as well, this is not just South Asian history. This is British history. This is part of British history, and that's why it is so important. And in uncovering the truth of our historical past, it's not just something that benefits the community and the minority that you're focusing on. It makes for a better society. This is for everybody. It makes for better people. It makes for a better society. It makes for a more well-informed, well-rounded, well-educated public. And that never has honesty, transparency, and knowledge never have those three things been a terrible thing for a nation. Never have those three things made anything worse. They evolve and they move things forward, and that brings clarity. And I think that you would want all of the facts at your disposal before you move forward on any issue. And I think our history is also a great example of that too. I'm mindful of time, so we're going to have to shoot through this question very quickly with our final three panelists, so we can at least get one or two from the comments here. So Sana, if we can very, very quickly go to you. Why do you think that it is important for us to teach South Asian history in our education system? And then this nuance and this type of history, why do you think particularly this is important to include?
So, I will pick up on the point that you made about honesty and the need to recover these voices honestly. And I agree with everything that the others have said, in the spirit of, the fact that this is a sort of shared history, and it isn't really possible to tell the history of Britain without the history of its former empire, of the South Asians and other immigrant communities who have been living there now for generations. But a word of caution, I think it's also important, as we celebrate these stories of resilience and grit and community building, that we must be also critical about investigating the silences, right, within families themselves, within communities. And also, as we sort of tell these stories, we do tell them from a critical perspective, from where they came from. Why the silences, right? The silences are part of not talking about trauma, which is certainly the case in Partition, in the Uganda expulsions, and in the East African sort of Asian community. The East African sort of experience becomes unified, even though, as many of you pointed out, the Kenyan, Ugandan, and Tanzanian experiences were very different. And there is an element of South Asians in Kenya in particular, but also other places in East Africa, being complicit, right, in the racial hierarchy that was set up, as being beneficiaries of it, even if they weren't actively, as Parminder rightly pointed out, they weren't the ones who were setting the laws, taking away the land. But there is a kind of privilege that comes from being from a particular socio-economic, legal perspective that I think must be reckoned with, in terms of why, for example, you said sort of, we were fully British, right? But what that meant for Kenya at the moment of independence was that the Indian community was, very distinct and sort of drawing its boundaries, even in Kitale, along racial lines that excluded sort of Africans. And so I think it's important not to gloss over the biases and discrimination and mutual, and this is not just one way. I think, there are tensions that emerge in communities living together. And I think it's important for two reasons. One, that is relevant for students today in Britain. I think it's important to be allies. I think that this new generation wants to be allies with other communities that have similar shared histories, but there has to be a critical sort of reckoning of the internal community before you can be a good ally. And I also think that, events across the world, and certainly in the UK, are showing the precariousness of citizenship itself. And there is that precariousness that comes with, being a member of a, former empire. And again, to be able to look back into the history to find those moments, people like Makhan Singh, people like Biogama Pinto and others who in the 1920s and 30s offered a different path of, and a different idea of belonging along this category of non-European people, which was quite different from being fully British, being fully Indian in terms of nationalism and citizenship as we understand it today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's very, very important to view everything on balance and to really interrogate the spaces where, like you've said, where the silence was and what that really means. And that's part of everything that Amina was saying also, that this is why we can do our best to gather oral history, and then we can do our best to do academic research. But part of embedding this in education is to give the overview and the analytical overview of analyzing the personal and the academic, and really bringing that together, which is what is needed, really, really what is needed. Saz, we're going to come to you. Why do you think it's important to enmesh this in our compulsory curriculum?
So one of the things that I find really quite interesting when we're doing this discussion, which is at the moment we're talking about East Africans. So we're talking about Africans and Asians, but don't forget there are Asians that came from Malaysia, there are Asians that come from Fiji, there are Asians, because again, as Sana pointed out, Indians have always gone across the Indian Ocean and settled in different places. And I think that the way for me is everybody can write an academic paper, and it's worth, those who want to explore would read it. But to make it accessible for every child or every person to understand, storytelling is I could have written stories which were about my experiences, but I didn't. I've kind of tried to weave in stories about people who are not necessarily all from the same background, who are from different parts of, but they may be classed as Indians, but are not necessarily all Indian in the same sense that they're not first generation migrants. They have been here for a long time. Some of them are from different parts of the world, but still have some cultural references that they adhere to. For schools, definitely, because there's very little. And one of the things that's quite interesting, and I know Sana was saying that very few people from East Africa talk about their histories, is that even when my parents were alive, when I did try to talk to them about it, a lot of it for them was traumatizing. There was trauma. And then the other thing that they seemed to kind of click to was the fact that if you don't talk about it, then nobody will point a finger at you. And therefore, if you become successful, education, be successful, heads down. And that's the thing that East Africans migrants did. Because what happened to them in Uganda, and my husband's family were the ones that were expelled, was the fact that they loved the country, and they all talk about how beautiful it was to be in East Africa. And just recently I went to see my uncle, and he was going on and on about how he would love to go back, and he's not well enough, and he loved living in Dar es Salaam. And he talks about the fact that he lost his job because of the Africanization Act and set up a business, and he loved his job, but he couldn't work in government anymore. And it's those types of stories. If you tell a story like that, you go in and tell that to somebody who's in primary school or somebody who's in secondary school, that story relates to them. And the thoughts are that more of those our stories matters, which is something that Natasha talks about all the time. It is our stories. If you write those stories, children will read them regardless of where they're from, regardless of whether they're Indian, West Indian, African, American. The fact that they've found a story that they can relate to, that will eventually, then they kind of go, oh, actually, that's why there are so many brown people in this country. Oh, that's why there are so many yellow people in this country. Because it's not about why we're here. It's about we have stories that make sure that we live in all parts of the world.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much, Saz. I think you're right. It's about resonating with particularly children as well. It's about the very human element, isn't it? And it's really, really beautiful. Lots to think about. Hello, Ian. How are you doing? Oh, you're on mute.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, just to, very briefly, I really liked what everybody's already said, to be honest. Just to reiterate, I think these histories are part of British history. That's important. They're also part of, Kenyan history, Ugandan history, Tanzanian history, Indian history, and so on. And there's also such a thing as, global history, transnational history, and as and this is about the international politics of decolonization, what happened to the South Asians in East Africa. This is also, depending on what way you look at it, this is part of human rights history and the story of the way racial discrimination played out. And as Sana alluded to, this is terribly complex. This is not just a sort of black and white story. There's many nuances to this, and there's a lot more work that can be done by all sorts of different historians, and also and as was also said about storytelling and oral history as well. And there's I just, because a lot of this is so recent, as close as sort of 50 years ago, we're only just having a sort of just a taste of what's at stake here. So as much as can be brought out, the better.
I agree. So we are, with South Asian Heritage Month, one of the projects that I'm starting over the next year, it's the 70th anniversary of Partition next year, and it's the 60th anniversary of the Ugandan expulsion of South Asian migrants next year as well. And it's about how we best memorialize and capture that, because we are losing so many. We're losing the generations that went through this, and we're losing so many stories that about that as well. So I'm trying to create a national archive of us and connect with all of the grassroots communities that are gathering that data, whether it's video testimony or whether it's photographs or letters or anything from around that time. And that's something that Amina's helping me with, and we are going to do a year-long project. But I would love for each of you as well, in terms of the 60th anniversary commemoration of the Ugandan expulsion. I feel like you could all add so much value here, and I would absolutely love to continue this conversation later on, and in discovering how best we can do that justice and in the most appropriate way, and in the way that can embed it in the national conscience, because education reform is something that we will constantly push for. And Amina is right. In the meantime, what can we do? How can we pivot? And with PEG, what they're doing is, okay, well, Parliament's debating it. We're not getting anywhere. Right. What can we do? Let's create the resource packs. Let's go to the ground. Let's get boots on the ground and actually get these in schools. And I think part of this is activism. Part of this is what else can we do to embed this in ways, if it's not happening from top down, let's go from down up. And I think that's the general consensus here. And I applaud you all for everything you're doing. I really do. It's been such a nourishing discussion. We've got time for like 2 questions. I'm so sorry, everybody. Right.
I think quickly, just to add on to what Natasha was saying, I think we're here today discussing this topic, and I feel, and when Natasha and I were sort of planning this event, we said, this is a topic that is hardly discussed. I personally have not seen many discussions at all in the UK. I know, Parminder, you did an event with the Punjab Heritage. I came across that one. But apart from that, the fact that we're here today is very much something to celebrate. We're having this conversation. We're hopefully getting the ball rolling and sort of highlighting this as a topic that we should continue to explore over the next year and over the next many years. So I guess applause to all of us for starting the conversation here and doing what we can to educate people. And, this video will be on YouTube and all of these different platforms for
and Twitter and
an indefinite amount of time. It's there forever. So I think we've done a really cool thing here.
Absolutely.
I also wanted to say something. One of the things that was a slide that Ian had of Ugandan Asians, who are 0.3% of the population. I remember a few years ago, I looked at the number of South Asians in Africa, and it's a tiny sum. It was as you can see, 1%, less than 1%. And, I think there were not only 500,000 people in all of East Africa. And yet, like the immigration narrative, it seems like these Asians are taking over. Remember, Margaret Thatcher said, we are being swamped. And when at that stage, I think the total South Asian population was about 2.something%. And I think that kind of knowledge of how somebody creates a discourse and a narrative, which makes it sound as if Asians are taking over. I mean, these are silences from kind of writers who are controlling what is written and why it's written.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's very significant to me, even though colonization and colonial colonization, and colonial development, etc., is very significant in the lives of people who have produced me, etc. But what is much more significant, and I'm now older, when I went to university, I did not meet a single Asian till I went to School of Oriental African Studies to do my PhD. That's the first time I met a Sikh, and I got into some of the South Asian stuff. So the thing is that there is also, now that people have been in Britain for something like 60 years or 50 years, etc., the other thing is that there are also people who come from that background, but for whom it's not colonization that's significant, it's race, it's dealing with race and racialization in an everyday kind of way. Hanif Qureshi writes that for him, it was an everyday occurrence that he was called a Paki. So when I do my work, what engages my imagination is often not the work on post-colonialism, often produced by very elite post-colonials. It is the work of African Americans, of Jews, of other marginalized, the Armenians. That is where I get sustenance from. And, you know, that's the point that Saz is making, that the experience of one group is really can learn from many other groups, and the storytelling about this group actually resonates with other groups who share that kind of background. And I think that experience of migration and race and settlement in Britain is part of that longer history of movement and settlement and so on and so forth.
I think you're exactly right. I think that's really well said. Okay, we're going to very quickly take this question. Is there a distinction to be made around forced versus voluntary migration? From Kat.
Absolutely. These are very different kinds of migrations. You could say that partition was forced migration, the expulsion of Ugandans was forced migration, and there's a lot of work on the difference between forced migration, refugees, and moved voluntarily. I mean, this is something that you can actually tune into. You know, these are these very big chunks of debates and discourse within the academy, and people do make those distinctions. I mean, these categories are around, yes.
So I'd like to add to that my father, when he had to leave Karachi, went to India. It was a forced migration to go to East Africa, because I don't think he would ever have gone if there hadn't been partition, because he was already based in Karachi. That's where he was going to be trading. That's where he was going to be working. His father was going to and fro from East Africa. They had no inclination. But as soon as partition happened and they had to come over from Karachi to India, the next thing they did was get on the boat and go to East Africa. So there is a forcedness about it. And the same with my husband's side of the family, who were all very well settled in Uganda. They still, at one stage when I first met them in the 80s, still hardly talked about their East African lifestyles. It's only now, we're talking nearly 50 odd years ago, that they are saying, well, it would be really nice to go back to visit. So I think there is a difference, because as a migrant who decides to move somewhere for economic benefits, it's a different thing. But those who migrate because they are forced to leave their countries, like the refugees in Syria, like the currently got Afghanistanis who are really kind of thinking they need to go, that is a trauma that they carry with them. So I think that's a very different thing altogether.
I agree. We have one from Ali as well. How do you think East African Asians who moved to Britain in the 60s and 70s differ from those migrating now? Is there a difference in mindset? We touched on this briefly, I think, but I think it's worth developing.
I think there's absolutely a difference in mindset. To those who arrived in the 60s and 70s, whether they came from India directly or the Caribbean or from East Africa, they had that shared experience that I mentioned earlier. So growing up in schools, going to school, my siblings were some of those who grew up in the early 1970s. And there was a camaraderie amongst all of those populations. So actually you'd stick up for each other and you'd kind of work together when you'd be bullied quite often. Whereas now there is a massive segregation, I see. Even within our own communities, if somebody's migrating and they're Telugu speaking or they're Marathi or something else, they would kind of sit within their own groups or bubbles. Whereas back then it was kind of a unified experience.
I agree with you. Does anybody else want to add to that?
I think the difference is that this country has become, as Parminder said, it's become fractional. As a South Asian community, we've got our own little enclaves, which wasn't what it was like when I was growing up in the 70s and even in the 80s. It's only afterwards that people started building their own separate temples, because obviously my background's Hindu. And then we didn't have the friendships that my parents had with people who were Muslims, who were Sikh, who were Goan, because my parents still kept in touch with all of their friends that were from East Africa that had come. It wasn't just the people from Tanzania, but it was also the people from Kenya, the people from Uganda. So as we grew up, we didn't have the same kind of connections to those people. And then I think it's just that, you're right, Sneha, there's a difference. I think 60s and 70s growing up here was very much, we are the minority, we all need to stick together. And those friendships that I've made with friends who are from the Afro-Caribbean, Nigerian, I still am very close to those friends, because we all came at a time when we were different, we were the outsiders.
So there was more unity and more cohesion, even though everybody was different. It's a really interesting perspective. Right, everyone, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Right on the nose, 2 hours. Love that. Thank you so much for joining us, Parminder, Sana, Ian, Saz, Sneha, Amina. It's been an absolute joy and an absolute pleasure. And it is my honor to close out South Asian Heritage Month with this incredibly powerful and necessary discussion, talking about this part of hidden history, really, within the wider canon of partition memory and migration as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in. We shall be seeing you later, and we hope you've had a wonderful South Asian Heritage Month, and we will see you next year.
And thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Mina.
Oh.
I mean, Sana Iyer is my neighbor here in Massachusetts, and we haven't met. We haven't met. We're meeting because of you and Amina and Ian. We've been corresponding on email, but haven't. Thank you for the togetherness that you promoted, and for the work. It's a lot of work to organize events. And I was telling Amina, I don't think I know anything about partition. I don't think I should be speaking anything. I'm grateful that you persuaded me, etc. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for joining today. It's been an incredible event. And thank you for making the time. I know whatever time zone you're in. I mean, where I am, it's midnight. But thank you to everyone.
Oh yes, that is something to mention. This is an international call that we are experiencing. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And also with regard to what Amina was saying with this video that will be on South Asian Heritage Month and South Asian Writers Socials forever now. Another thing, in my capacity as literary lead, and thank you, Ali, that's very kind of you. In my capacity as literary lead, and also within South Asian Heritage Month, a lot of our content from the lit side is focused around education and around children, and what we are reflecting back to children through the work that we're creating and what we're putting in front of them. And so this will now go into the literary pack that I am sending out to, and there'll be a post-Psalm literature pack with all of the rundown of all the great things that happened during the month, and this will be going to libraries and schools and councils up and down the country. So I think that we could start some really, really meaningful conversations here. And like Amina said, this is just the beginning. So thank you so much for joining us. We will let you all get on with your evenings or mornings or afternoons, wherever you may be in the world. And we will see you next year. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.